Welcome to episode 181 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It is April 30, 1938. Wembley, the FA Cup final. Preston North End against Huddersfield Town. And this is one of those football afternoons that somehow manages to sit at the junction of almost everything the English game had become by the late 1930s. Old giants, old institutions, a national stadium, the BBC, mass audience, a goalless grind, then one absurd, immortal line from the commentary box. Because after 29 minutes of extra time, with the match still locked at 0-0, BBC commentator Thomas Woodrooffe says, "If there's a goal scored now, I'll eat my hat." Seconds later, Preston are awarded a penalty. George Mutch slams it in, Preston win the cup, and Woodrooffe spends the next week learning that football has a nasty sense of timing. To understand how we got here, you have to start with where the FA Cup sat in English life by 1938. 2 days ago on the show, when we inaugurated Wembley, we talked about how Charles Alcock's knockout invention had grown from the improvised Little World of 1871 into the biggest domestic event in the country. By the interwar years, the FA Cup final was not just a football match, it was a ritual, a national appointment, a social event, a royal event, a broadcasting event. The league title mattered deeply, of course, but the cup final still had a singular glamour that no other domestic fixture could quite match. And the two clubs in the 1938 final carried enormous historical weight. Preston North End were the old pioneers, the first league champions, the great invincibles, the first team to do the double in 1889. But that heroic age was now half a century behind them. They had not become a modern empire. They had become a grand old club living on memory, occasionally flaring back into significance. Huddersfield Town, by contrast, belonged to a more recent greatness. They had won the FA Cup in 1922, then under Herbert Chapman and after him Cecil Potter, became the first club to win the English League 3 years in a row, from 1923-24 to 1925-26. So this final was not simply two good teams, it was the meeting of two different eras of English power. And yes, the 1922 final mattered here. That had also been Preston against Huddersfield, and that had also ended 1-0, and that had also been decided by a penalty. And for Huddersfield, that 1922 cup win was the first major trophy of the Chapman era, the beginning of the rise that would soon make them champions and then triple champions. So there was symmetry in 1938 before a ball was even kicked. Preston were trying to reverse an old hurt. Huddersfield were trying to prove that their greatness still had one more cup in it. The road to Wembley was strong on both sides. Preston beat West Ham United 3-0, Leicester City 2-0, Arsenal 1-0, Brentford 3-0, and then Aston Villa 2-1 in the semi-final. Huddersfield beat Hull City 3-1, Notts County 1-0, Liverpool 1-0, and then needed a replay to get past York City before beating Sunderland 3-1 in the semi-final. These were serious routes. No soft landing for either finalist. Preston in particular arrived with a strong blend of defensive authority and a little bit of Scottish steel, which matters because this was a very Scottish Preston side, right down to one of the men in it, Bill Shankly. That is another reason this final is so rich. Because Bill Shankly is here, at left half for Preston, still years away from becoming the transformative manager of Liverpool, and already at the centre of a major football day. Preston in that period had a very Scottish feel, with Shankly joined by players such as Andy Beattie and George Mutch. In retrospect, it looks almost like a historical junction box, one of the central future managers of British football, still a player, still chasing a cup medal. And now add broadcasting. The 1938 final was the first FA Cup final to be televised in full by the BBC. That matters enormously. The cup had long been a national event. Now it was becoming a national image. Not everybody could see it, of course. Television ownership was tiny still, but that was almost beside the point. The technology had arrived. Football was no longer only a thing you attended, read about, or heard on the wire. It was becoming something you could watch in your home. And the man at the microphone for this particular leap forward was Thomas Woodrooffe, a retired Royal Navy lieutenant commander who had become one of BBC's main voices of the 1930s. He was already a known broadcaster, already a familiar public voice, and as it happened, already a man with a taste for memorable lines. Then came the match, and truth be told, it was not a classic in the artistic sense. It was tense, careful, attritional, the kind of final where history and nerves sit on the players' shoulders and refuse to let the football flow. Preston had spells, Huddersfield had spells, but neither side could force the break. 90 minutes came and went without a goal. Wembley waited, the BBC waited, England waited, King George waited, and the game trudged into extra time, still scoreless. That was not entirely shocking. These were defensively serious teams, and finals then were often much more about control than sparkle. But as the extra time drained away, the match started to feel as if it was hardening into one of those frustrating cup finals people remember more for endurance than inspiration. And then, in the 119th minute, everything changed. Bill Shankly played George Mutch through. Mutch burst towards goal. Huddersfield captain Alf Young challenged him from behind. Referee Arthur Jewell pointed straight to the spot. Now there's the drama. Mutch had won the penalty, but he was also hurt in the collision. He had to pick himself up, collect himself, and then take the kick that would decide the cup. This is where Shankly's own later recollection gives the moment its texture. Mutch drove the penalty so hard that it hit the bar, took the paint off it, literally, and screamed into the goal, and ran down the back of the net. Preston North End 1, Huddersfield Town 0. With barely time for more than a restart, that was the final. And in the commentary box sat Thomas Woodrooffe, who had just offered to eat his hat if there was a goal. Football, naturally, had called his bluff immediately. So what? First, yes, the hat. Woodruff really did keep his promise, in a fashion. A few days later, he appeared and ate a hat made of cake and marzipan. Not felt, not cloth, not an actual trilby, but enough to make the point, and enough to ensure that the line lived forever. Maybe the earliest great example of the commentator's curse in football broadcasting. And it has had plenty of descendants since. The modern English classic, is probably Alan Hansen's 1995 line that you can't win anything with kids, just before Manchester United's young side won the double. But Woodruff set the standard. Make a categorical claim in football, and the game will often punish you in under a minute. Also, this was Preston's last major trophy. That is one of the melancholy beauties of this story. The old pioneers reached back and took one more great honor, but no league title followed, no new imperial phase, no modern renaissance. Preston remained historically immense and institutionally proud, but 1938 still stands as their last major silverware. In a way, that makes the goal even more precious. It was not one more trophy in a parade, it was the final great one. Huddersfield's afterlife is fascinating too. They lost this final, and then history was about to stop for war. They never returned to the heights of the 1920s, but the match left a remarkable managerial trail. 3 of the players on the field that day later managed Huddersfield Town. Eddie Boot of Huddersfield, and from the Preston side, Andy Beattie, and yes, Bill Shankly. Shankly's spell with Huddersfield came before the much bigger chapter, of course. In 1959, he went to Liverpool, and the rest is one of football's great stories. We covered that in episode 31 on December 1st, and I recommend going back and listening to that. But on April 30, 1938, he was still only a player, still only one of the men trying to win a cup final, not yet the man who would remake Anfield. And maybe that is the best way to understand this final. It sits right at the edge of several worlds. The old FA Cup, still the grandest date in English domestic football. The old great clubs, Preston and Huddersfield, carrying different generations of glory. The old Wembley, already sacred. And the new medium of television, beginning its long takeover of football experience. The match itself was mostly a grind. The ending was perfect. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 30, 1938. First, this was a classic FA Cup final, not because the football was brilliant, but because the occasion was huge, the tension relentless, and the ending unforgettable. Second, Thomas Woodrough's line became legend because football answered it instantly, and because broadcasting had finally arrived in full at the cup final. And third, the match sits on the threshold of change, Preston's last great triumph, Huddersfield's last final for generations, and Bill Shankly, still a player, before he became Bill Shankly, the manager. On this day in 1938, Preston North End beat Huddersfield Town 1-0 in the first fully televised FA Cup final, George Mutch scoring from the penalty spot in the final minute of extra time, just seconds after commentator Thomas Woodrooffe had vowed to eat his hat if there were a goal. And then there was. And then he actually ate a hat. That's all for episode 181 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. Tomorrow, go to May 1st, 1958, when an odd and almost 3-year-long tournament, the Intercities Fairs Cup, finally had its first winner. See you then.